Now, let's make early observations now about Homer's Odyssey. We're moving from the Iliad now to the Odyssey. And the place that we want to begin is with certain kinds of general observations, introductions. I actually want to begin by pointing out what I pointed out in an earlier lecture. Samuel Butler in the 50s published an essay that was quite controversial in which he argued the following. One, the two-part argument. One, the authors of the Iliad and the Odyssey were not the same person. To McGee.
Do you know how funny it would be to be on the other end of that? You answer the phone. The authors. Everyone's like, yeah.
He said, no matter what we know about this author, which we know bloody little of, no matter what we know about this author that we call Homer, clearly the guy who wrote the Iliad is not the guy who wrote the Odyssey. They are two different people, obviously. For the same reason that, for example, we would pick up young author stories, for example, and say they're clearly not written by the same person. Everything about them is different in terms of all the overall characteristics, and to that degree, not the same person. So that was the first thing that he said. That, by the way, was not unusual. People had been saying this for a long time, that when you pick up the Iliad and you read it, and then you pick up the Odyssey and you actually read the entire thing cover to cover, one of the immediate things that you see is they are two different kinds of poems entirely, in almost every way. The second argument was more radical, though. Butler argued that the Iliad clearly is a story told in a masculine voice, and to that degree by a male. The Odyssey, however, is a story told in a feminine voice, and then he made the radical suggestion that the writer of the Odyssey was in fact a woman, not a male. Well, given, of course, that both of these texts, the Iliad and the Odyssey, along with the Aeneid, are kind of the stalwart centers of the patriarchal canon, this was a pretty radical view, that a woman would be the one responsible for the Odyssey. Now, why is it that Butler would even make these observations at all? Well, let's spend a few minutes and talk about this, all right? And now we're talking for your notes, if you want to kind of head them in your notes, as the divergent narrative approaches of the Iliad and the Odyssey. Two different ways of telling a story. One way we're going to call the way of the Iliad is a very linear approach. A happens, then B happens, then C happens, and so on. It's fairly predictable, and it's can we kind of say it? It's what we would call, I suppose, if you were speaking in kind of general language, it's the way a man tells a story. First this happened, then this happened, then this happened, the end. Let's get to it and get done with it. Okay? The Odyssey is something quite different. In some ways, you could argue it's a pretty sophisticated way to tell a story. Now, some of you are going to say, I'm not so sure that soap operas are sophisticated, but I'm going to point out one way that at least soap operas are sophisticated. Are you familiar with soap operas on TV?
Like Days of Our Lives?
No.
Are you kidding?
Days of Our Lives, a good example. Well, let's point out something about Days of Our Lives, for example. And I am, by the way, not saying this because I watched large amounts of Days of Our Lives.
You don't have to lie to us.
But, having said that, there's one or two things, Mr. Keller, I found about soap operas that we should probably point out as being useful or significant. Notice how the story gets told in Days of Our Lives, or any other soap opera for that matter. You have a scene, maybe a daughter and her mother, and they're having this argument or whatever, right? Argue. And then all of a sudden the scene fades out, and then immediately you go to a different scene, where, for example, you have this guy in this car chase, right? And then all of a sudden that one fades out, and then you go to this other scene where these two lovers maybe are doing their thing, right? Having conversation or etc. And then all of a sudden notice that you jump back to the earlier scene between the mother and the daughter, and they immediately are engaged in the very same conversation that they ended with. right? And then they jump from there to the two lovers, maybe in their conversation. And then from there to the car chase. And then back to the lovers, and then back to the mother and the daughter. And this is the way soap operas get told, right? We know this kind of storytelling approach. Well, notice what is assumed about this approach of narrative. This assumption by the storyteller in soap operas is that you're going to remember what was happening last. That's what I mean by sophisticated. You're going to remember, oh yeah, that's right. You can hold at least 3 strands of thought in your mind concurrently. Oh, that's right. The mother and daughter were having that conversation, and that's kind of where that thing left off. And then there was this car chase, and then there were these two lovers thing, and now we're back to, oh, I got it. That's right. See how that works? The people who make soap operas assume that you have enough memory to be able to kind of get what was happening last so that there doesn't have to be any reference to it whatsoever, right? None. It's like the minute they go back to the scene with the daughter and the mother, there's no like, okay, do you remember what we were doing? There's none of that. You inject in medias res is the Latin term for in the middle of the action. You jump right into the middle of the action. And the assumption is that you can kind of remember what was going on before. Okay, what was happening before. The Odyssey is this kind of story. And it's because of this that Butler said, men don't tell stories this way. Men in 5th century BCE don't tell stories this way. Women tell stories this way, Butler says, but not men. Now, immediately there was a huge debate about his assumptions, right? And you could kind of get a sense that what he was kind of saying was that the Iliad is not a very sophisticated way to tell a story. A to B to C to D. On the other hand, the Odyssey, pretty sophisticated way to tell a story. Well, you can imagine there were a few male readers of Butler's essay that were like, how dare you suggest that women are more sophisticated in their storytelling than are men, you see, in this kind of thing. But there are other good arguments as to why maybe the Odyssey is a poem that seems to have more of a feminine element than the Iliad. Think, for example, of the influence of Athena in the Odyssey that you do not see happening, for example, in the Iliad. You could argue that the most important person in the Odyssey is not Odysseus, but rather Athena. She drives all the action. She's the one with all the power. And she, of course, centers, she's paramount in a lot of the books of the Odyssey. She's a strong, dominant kind of goddess. She's celebrated for her dominance, for her ability to make the action move forward. And when she, for example, meets Odysseus on the, at the end of the poem, she marvels at Odysseus' ability to spin a story. She likes that. She's like, wow, you're pretty good at this. As if somehow she's critiquing good storytelling. Good storytelling, good lying, is what a really good poet can do, as opposed to the Iliad, that is an entirely different kind of approach to storytelling. Come back tomorrow and we will continue with this strand of thinking. I'm sorry, in 2 days, right? We have Atlas.